Well, if you have a Bible, please turn back to the Old Testament book of Daniel in the 11th chapter. The message today is, will you end up compromising? Will you end up compromising? In Daniel chapter 11, there's some interesting words at the end of verse 27 where it says, the end shall be at the time appointed. That's interesting. It reveals to us that God has a timetable. And may we never forget that. God is never early. God is never late. He's always on time. He always has a master plan. And all the political wannabes and rulers and so on are only fulfilling that plan within God's framework. So we find that this all started in the third year of Cyrus the king. We find out Daniel's having a time of prayer and fasting for 3 weeks. And it's about 530 BC. And then we find out Daniel is told here by the angel what's going to take place in the years to come. And so what is happening now that Daniel is hearing about is out yonder in the future by about 350 years. Daniel would be dead when all of this takes place. It took place around 175 BC. And at that time, Antiochus Epiphanes was the king of Syria, and Syria was over Israel. Israel was under their control, and that's where we left off. Let's look at verse number 29. It says, at the time appointed, he, Antiochus Epiphanes, shall return and come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. So we find here something takes place. Antiochus Epiphanes is going to go down. He's going to try and conquer Egypt once again. And we know this tit-for-tat battle, this seesaw, going back and forth kind of thing, been going on for some time. We also remember that Antiochus had a hero. Remember who it was? Alexander the Great. I can see him getting up every morning and saluting the bust of Alexander the Great and kissing that statue of Alexander the Great. He had a lot of respect for Alexander the Great, and he wanted to be the next Alexander the Great. Antiochus Epiphanes was a nut. And anyway, we find out in verse number 29, at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. But notice, it shall not be as the former or as the latter. So he had grandiose plans of going out like Alexander and conquering the world and so on. But we find out something interrupts that. Verse 30 says, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved. What happened here? Well, we've talked about this. Kittim being that region of the Mediterranean world. This is a reference to Rome. Now, Rome was not yet the major power it would be, but it was starting to flex its muscles. And if you remember the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, the head was of gold. That was the Babylonian kingdom, followed by the silver kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire, followed by the brass kingdom. That would be Alexander the Great and Greece. And then the legs were of iron, a picture of the up-and-coming Roman kingdom. Now, the Punic Wars from 264 to 146 BC, along with some ongoing conflicts with Greece, brought about the control of Carthage and Athens and Corinth, and Rome conquered all that part of the world, the Macedonian world, if you will, and hence it became the maritime power in the Mediterranean. So this is a reference years before Rome was anything about the ships of Kittim coming and conquering the Assyrians. Now verse 30 tells us the ships of Kittim shall come against him, Antiochus Epiphanes, therefore he shall be grieved. What happened here? Well, his ego took a hit. Antiochus Epiphanes was like a spoiled brat that had missed a lot of spankings. And he wanted his way all the time. And so he was going to march on Memphis and Alexandria. And that caught the attention of the rising Roman Empire. And remember that Antiochus had spent some years as a hostage in Rome. You remember that? So they had his number. They knew he was a nut. And they knew he was a loser. But he was a pest with an army. That's what made him a menace. He was a legend in his own mind. I think we all know somebody like that, right? Somebody or another. So Rome decided to put an end to this tit-for-tat thing going on between Syria and Egypt. And so basically, the ships of Kittim show up and they stop this. They say, that's enough. You're upsetting the balance of power in the world. And Rome sent a general by the name of Aegeus. And it took place in a region known as Eleusia. The year was 170 BC. This is a very famous historical event, the Day of Eleusia. And Daniel actually predicted this 350 years that this was going to happen. This is a confrontation that took place, and it really caused Antiochus to snap. Because you remember the story, General Agaius shows up, and the Bible tells us that he withstood him. What happened is he said, "You've gone far enough. I want you to turn around and go home." Now, Antiochus, full of pride, didn't want to lose face, and so he said, "Well, let me consult here with my cabinet." And that's when General Agaius walked up to him with his sword. He drew a circle around him, and he said, "You'll give me your decision before you come out of that circle there." And anyway, Antiochus got red-faced, humiliated, devastated, basically got his tail feathers clipped, and he had to surrender. And verse 30 tells us he was grieved. He was grieved. And at that time, something snapped. Historians tell us he was never the same. He was kind of an eccentric before, almost fun-loving and a weirdo and all that. But at that point on, something snapped. And he's going to take it out on somebody. He's in a bad mood. You can guess what follows. He's going to vent out his wrath on the Jews. It's the day of Elusha, 170 BC. God predicted it 350 years beforehand. But possibly this is something that was predicted like more than 1,000 years beforehand. There was a carnal prophet by the name of Balaam. You remember him during the days of Moses and such. And in Numbers 24, here's what he said out of the blue, verse 24. "And ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, and shall afflict Asher, and shall afflict Eber, and he also shall perish forever." Bible scholars can't figure out any other place where this was fulfilled except this very event, the day of Elusha. And the coast of Kittim means Rome. So ships come from the coast of Rome, and shall afflict Asher. That's another Bible word for Assyria. And shall afflict Eber. We get our word Hebrew from that. And he, being a reference, I believe, here to Antiochus Epiphanes, shall perish forever. So imagine this all being fulfilled, and that is interesting. Now, back to verse number 30. "For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved." Historians tell us he was so traumatized by this, so embarrassed by this. He absolutely snapped. And yes, he was a nut before, but now he's a mad nut, an angry nut. And so this put Antiochus over the brink. He vents out his rage on the Jewish people. And history tells us he went into town and he massacred them. It mentions the Holy Covenant there at the end of verse number 30. He went berserk. It involved the Holy Covenant, the Jewish people. And it was pure evil what he did. In fact, even historians wonder if he was possessed. The Jews were his whipping boy. And you say, well, why the Jewish people? Well, why the Jewish people today? I mean, have you ever stopped to wonder, what is the deal with this? Obviously, the devil hates God, and the devil hates any reminder of God. So the devil hates the nation of Israel, and he will do everything he can to get rid of them. So Antiochus Epiphanes rides into Jerusalem. He immediately massacres 40,000 people. We're talking about the city of Moorhead, maybe. And then he took another 40 to 50,000 into slavery, and then he plundered Jerusalem. And I said last time, how many times has Jerusalem been plundered? How much blood has been shed into the soil in that region of Jerusalem? It's the most blood-soaked city in the world, over and over and over again. Now, it goes on and it mentions in verse number 30 that he shall have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Can you guess what this is about? Antiochus Epiphanes at that point kind of forms an alliance, a confederacy with those that forsake the covenant. So we're talking about those who were, I guess, Jews, if you will, but they compromise. They side with Antiochus. And let me just say, there's always liberals and apostates and those who will side against their own people, sadly. And we've seen Jason so far. We've seen Menelaus so far. You know, it's hard enough for a child of God to be fighting enemies on the outside, isn't it? And you expect that opposition from the world. But there will always be insiders who turn on believers. Paul had his enemies. No doubt he had those enemies from within, because he warned some Ephesian pastors in Acts 20:30. He says, also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. That can really take the wind out of your sails, can't it? But it does happen. So Antiochus Epiphanes had some help when he came into Jerusalem. And historians tell us that those who stuck by the stuff were put to death. And historians also tell us that as they heard rumors of Antiochus and his army, his angry army, coming into Jerusalem, there was a fear in the air. It gripped the city of Jerusalem. Now, I've said many times, Antiochus is a picture of the Antichrist. Can you imagine the fear that's going to prevail in the coming tribulation? I mean, the Great Tribulation. And by the way, the coming Great Tribulation, it's going to affect the whole world, but it's primarily, once again, for Israel. We find out in Jeremiah, it says, alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Jacob being Israel here. The coming tribulation is also known as Jacob's trouble. It's going to be a time of horrible chaos. Jesus even spoke of it in Matthew 24. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. And we've never lived through such a crisis as this, thank God for that, where you have a fear of a menace who's coming to destroy you. You know, in World War II, the nation of England, the island of England, was being blitzed continually by Hitler. And every night they lived in fear of those bombs falling on them. Now, we find the Jews on pins and needles because they know Antiochus Epiphanes is coming. He's going to raise havoc. He's upset, and he will kill and plunder, which brings us to verse number 31. It says, an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. Now, we're just going to take it that far. Daniel chapter 11 actually covers about 550 years of history. And in fact, it includes what we call the 400 silent years. You know what they are. That's that time period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We call it the intertestamental period here. And the Old Testament ends with Malachi signing off and saying the next thing on the horizon is John the Baptist, and then the New Testament opens up. But when we started Daniel chapter 11 here, I don't know if you remember, but it opened with Alexander the Great. And now it's going to end with Antiochus Epiphanes, but actually it's going to end with the Antichrist. We're getting into that. And so technically it covers probably, well, it'd be 2,500 years already if the Antichrist came on the scene tonight. So the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, remember this, about 536 BC. And so some time has elapsed. We're now at about 175 BC, and we're looking at the evil reign of Antiochus Epiphanes from 175 BC to 164 BC, a period of about 11 years. We are now down to the last, get this, 3.5 years. 3.5 years of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. It is the most volatile. It is the most nasty. And all Bible scholars agree Antiochus Epiphanes is a picture of the Antichrist. And this is going to help us to understand some things about the Antichrist and even this 3.5 year period. We're now looking at the worst persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes toward the Jews. And in verse 31, it says, and arms shall stand up on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. That's a familiar term, the abomination of desolation. Folks, I'll just put it this way. We're getting into the good stuff right now. All right, the good stuff. Antiochus Epiphanes, according to verse 31, is going to pull something here. I'll explain it as we go. But what he is going to do in a nutshell is he's going to try and outlaw religion or legislate religion. And we're not familiar with that in our country that much yet. In fact, this country was founded for religious liberty. But there have been countries, there have been areas, the USSR and such, that have had the clamps put down on religion. In fact, even in days gone by in England, imagine that. They shut down religion. They had a state religion, a state church, and so on. And that went on throughout Europe. In fact, the reason the U.S. started was freedom-loving people came over here to worship God and freedom. So this business of legislating religion, Antiochus is about to do, that's pretty common. It happened in our very nation here. And by the way, it was Baptists who led the way to religious freedom in this country, who said, no, we can't have just one state church. And by the way, Patrick Henry, not a Baptist, but an ally of the Baptists, said the Baptist faith, we'll make it the state religion. And guess who protested? It was the Baptists. They said, no, that's not biblical. That's not the way it works. Everybody should have religious liberty. And we've had it now for all these years. But that was the sticking point with the birth of our nation. And really, there were some, even at that time, some Baptists who paid the price with blood. Now, every day in this nation, the Christian Law Association, CLA, is defending churches. In fact, a while back, there was a local municipality that told a local church, a Baptist church in that city, you can't fly the Christian flag outside of your church. And it was like, what? And by the way, they'll try this stuff. Well, they called CLA. CLA came in, said, you can't do that. And the officials backed right down. You know, every so often there has to be a hand slap, or they will take ground that is not theirs. And you say, well, when do we obey them? When do we not obey them? Any decree against the Word of God has to be challenged. There has to be a godly defiance at that time. Even the apostles did that. They were told to stop preaching, and they said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Folks, it's coming down to whether your children are your kids or the states. Did you know that? Your kids or the government. And who is going to have the right to educate them? They are slowly trying to legislate your liberties, and it's not a new thing. Antiochus Epiphanes is going to try something that really is very common to the devil. And so for 3.5 years, he is going to try and legislate religion. He's going to put the clamps on the religion of the Jewish people, obviously. So get these dates, all right? From June of 168 BC till October of 165 BC is when this is going to play out. If you do the math, that's 3.5 years. Exactly. How long is the Great Tribulation? 3.5 years. Any coincidence? I don't think so. Antiochus parallels the Antichrist, and he's a foreshadow of a lot of things that are coming. So the motive of Antiochus Epiphanes, at least he said, according to the historians, his motive that he claimed was that he wanted to unify, get that word, unify his section of the world. He wanted to just kind of bring the whole kingdom into one. That's also familiar. That's exactly going to be the line of the Antichrist. And so he said, well, we want to have one philosophy. That's Hellenism. That's Greek culture. He said, we want to have one religion. And he said, we want to have in our area one ruler. Oh, I guess that probably would be him. And so anyway, his battle cry was unite. Remember that. Unite. And he said everybody is going to have to comply under Hellenism, the Greek culture. Now, he knew that the Jews would dig in, obviously. You know, there's always going to be a crowd that does not cave in. There'll always be a crowd, and probably the majority that does. But really, Antiochus Epiphanes, according to historians, wanted an excuse to go toe-to-toe with the Jews. He had it all planned. So he throws out the gauntlet. And he said, this is it. We got to have a common religion in order to unite this area. But here's the sticky thing. He did not require the Jewish people to totally abandon Jehovah. Now listen to this carefully. He said, all you have to do is recognize other gods. You can hang on to Jehovah, but you have to recognize Pluto and Horus and Mercury and Zeus. And by the way, this is always how the clever devil works. Just know this. He wants to make those who take a stand look bad, like they're uncooperative. And so he said, look, it's not that big a deal. You don't have to give up your beliefs. You just have to embrace everybody else's belief. And it sounds reasonable, but is it? And so here we have decisions today to follow the Bible or to follow the world's philosophy. And if we try to follow the world, we're going to have to embrace the sodomite lifestyle and the transgender thing and ecumenicism and whatever else form of ungodliness and perversion and so on. We're going to have to say, well, you know, we're okay with that. So here's Antiochus. He wanted to make the Jews look like hard noses. And he says, you have to embrace all the gods, especially Zeus. Zeus. Oh, by the way, guess who the earthly representative of Zeus was? It was Antiochus Epiphanes. So he would end up being the kingpin god. And the devil is always smarter than to pull the whole rug out all at once. Remember that. He goes slowly. He inoculates people just a little bit at a time. And eventually the conscience gets seared, a callus forms over it, as the devil interjects compromise a little bit at a time. You know, back in probably the 1940s, Bible Christianity, at least those near to our camp, were getting a little bit nasty and a little bit rough, quite honestly. And so there was a group that got together and they said, you know, we've been a little bit ugly, and so we need to just tone it down, and let's just compromise in these areas. That was, about 80 years ago. And they have slowly become so much like the world at this point, you can't tell them apart from Christians. That's what happens. And as you compromise, you slowly get numbed. You get numbed. We have a society now actually believing that you can change your biological gender. Now, obviously, the DNA, everything, the Bible obviously says otherwise. It's absolutely unbelievable, but folks are slowly buying into it and being brainwashed. And if you would have tried to sell that bill of goods back in the 70s, if you'd have just, okay, this is what we're going to do, it would have been like, huh? And people would have just rejected it. But now it's being accepted, even though it's totally the opposite of what even Jesus Christ said. In Mark 10:6, Jesus said, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. It's pretty plain. God makes you male or female. But now the ungodly are making enough noise to where people are buying into this. And parents, I hope you're talking to your kids, because they're getting this message from the world and they're going to buy into it. If somebody says something long enough and loud enough, it will brainwash people. And by the way, ironically, the world looks at Bible-believing Christians and say, you people are brainwashed. Really? Look who's brainwashed. I call it a slow lying. A slow lying. And if you slowly lie to people, they will eventually believe it. Lincoln even said that. You know that compromise will always try to get you to embrace the lowest common denominator. And so here's Antiochus. He said, just, worship all the gods. We'll let you keep your own. And if you compromise, remember this, you'll eventually be called upon to embrace the lowest common denominator. And so Antiochus says, all right, you guys, you can have Jehovah, but you got to accept the rest. And you have to make Zeus the kingpin. He's going to be the major god. Now, here's human reasoning. It says, well, no big deal. Get with the program. Really don't have to be so black and white. Well, Christ said this in Matthew 12. He that is not with me is against me. And he that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad. That sounds pretty black and white to me. You're either with me or you're against me. I believe that if the heads start rolling, if we could put it that way, the compromisers will probably be standing with the apostates. That's how change works. We may be standing alone. Now, here's how compromise also works. Once you go along with a little bit of compromise, yeah, okay, I can go for that. Compromise is never satisfied. You say, well, I changed my position. No, you don't change your position. Change is a position. Once you change, it becomes your position. You keep changing, and you keep changing, and you keep changing. And that's how you get numb to it. You always want to move the boundary. You always want to take the bar lower. That's how change works. So after some Jews get on board, then Antiochus Epiphanes, he has a harebrained idea, all right? He says there's too many gods now, and it's just really not necessary. What we need is a God king. Guess who? Oh, sorry, flashback. Guess who? Woody Woodpecker? No, just kidding. Guess who this is going to be? It's going to be Antiochus Epiphanes. The devil knows that man is incurably religious. And he is. And in fact, in the days of old, when the Roman emperor and that whole concept of a Caesar and all that, it got old after a few hundred years, okay? And the Roman emperor was losing his sway. And so he decided, I got to rule from a spiritual angle. Did you know this historically? He realized he was losing his sway over the people politically, but he could gain that sway spiritually. And so hence you have what's known as the Bishop of Rome, and it evolves in the papacy and so on. And really, that's what Antiochus realizes. Man is religious. So now Jehovah is going to have to bow before the government. And there were a lot of Jews at that point, they'd already compromised, and so they decided not to make any waves. But there was a remnant that said, we're not going to do it. And there always is. And today it's true Bible-believing Christian people, thank God for them, who cannot go along with that. They're not going to offend God in order to go with man. And should God have to share center stage with a man, with heathen gods? You know, if you go back to the Ten Commandments, you find Exodus 20 saying, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's pretty plain, isn't it? And you find the next verse, God says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. He's making it pretty plain. No other gods. And then the next verse says, thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. We look at that, we go, huh? God is jealous? Well, it's a godly jealousy. And God is saying here, why should I share center stage with some kind of a false god? That are no gods, the New Testament says, or some man, some sinful man. God created all things. He has every right to have a godly jealousy. You know, I have a godly jealousy over my wife. I think all of you are married. You have a godly jealousy over your spouse, don't you? You know, want to share them with everybody. So Zeus comes along, and Antiochus says, worship Zeus. And that's me, by the way. And the Jews would not, because they knew that God is a jealous God. James put it this way. Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? It's talking about the Spirit of God dwelling in us, who wants all of us. He is a jealous God. You know, Paul started that church at Corinth, and he won them to Christ. He nurtured them along spiritually. He made quite an investment in them, and he really, really cared about them. And then they started to go sour, and now he has to rebuke them. And he says in 2 Corinthians 11, would to God you could bear with me a little in my folly, and indeed bear with me, for I am jealous over you with godly jealousy. For I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. Now he's talking about a New Testament church and wanting to present that church to the Lord as a chaste virgin. We could talk a lot here about the bride of Christ and what it involves and so on. But he says, I want you to be a pure bride for the Lord. In contrast to a harlot church that is described over in the book of Revelation. John sees it. In Revelation 17, he says, so he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast. This is a picture of this apostate religion riding in on the back of the Antichrist, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication, talking about spiritual apostasy. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon, the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. This is John looking down the time tunnel and seeing what would become of Christianity. And something in the first century was just, New Testament churches, autonomous, independent churches. But he sees what became of all that. And the next verse says, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. That word admiration doesn't mean he admired her. It means he was shocked. He was shocked to see what would become of something so simple and wonderful as a New Testament church. And by the way, there is an organization that is drunken with the blood of the martyrs, the saints of old. And John looked at this and it's like, yikes, I can't believe this. Let me just say, if we do not resist apostasy, if we do not resist compromise and capitulation, there's no telling where you end up. And we find a picture of that in what John saw. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, up to 169 BC, he was simply known as King Antiochus. But all of a sudden, he gives himself a new title. Here it is. Theos Epiphanes. I wonder what that means. Theos Epiphanes. You talk about a big head. He thinks he's God now. And he's going down. In fact, in Isaiah 2, God says, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Antiochus is going down. He's going to be humbled. He's haughty, he's proud, but the ending is it's a train wreck. We'll see it next time. But let me just say this, folks. Don't ever start down that road. Don't ever compromise. It's the point of no return. Honestly, if Jesus Christ is not Lord of all, he's not Lord at all. There's a pressure coming, and you and I dare not capitulate. The Bible tells us in the book of the Revelation they're going to actually worship the Antichrist, a man, no less. You say, well, that's impossible. They'd never worship a man. It goes on all the time, folks. I remember as a boy, when the Beatles came over from England, they landed at Kennedy Airport and performed in Shea Stadium. And I'm telling you, the gals were hysterical. They were trying to break through and swooning and touch the Beatles and all that. I'm telling you, it's a common practice to worship man. You know that when Elvis died in August of 77, there were some people who committed suicide. When John Lennon died in December of 1980, there were some people who committed suicide. It is far more common than you think. So much fanfare over flesh. You ever thought about that? I mean flesh that still has BO and bad breath and smelly socks and nose drizzle and earwax. And I mean, we're talking flesh, okay? There's nothing there to worship. We are depraved at best, and we're slowly dying. But yeah, mankind worships mankind, and they will worship the Antichrist one day. In Revelation 13, it says, and all the world wondered after the beast. That word wondered means they admired him. They marveled at him. So Antiochus Epiphanes, he insists on getting honored here, and he is actually expecting a little bit of resistance from the Jews. In verse 31, it says, and arms shall stand on his part. That word arms, it's a military expression. We get our word army from it. So what Antiochus does is he sends his army of soldiers to Jerusalem to enforce this decree of putting the clamps on religion. He had a general by the name of Apollonius. He was a key general, and there was another guy who went with him. We don't know his name, but he was from Athens. He was they just refer to him in history as the Athenian elder. And so they come to town, and they come with this decree to forbid the Jews to practice their faith. And there were thousands of soldiers there to enforce this with these two men. And Antiochus had already bought off some Jews. We read about that in verse number 32. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. That's what that part means. Now, anyway, we find that this general Apollonius, he comes to town and he just hangs around for a few days. And if you watch the old Westerns, whenever a gunslinger would come to town, he'd just go in the bar and he'd just kind of hang around for a while and he'd size things up and take notes and so on. Well, that's what this general did. He didn't start something right away. He's just kind of observing. And he's waiting until Saturday, waiting until the Sabbath. And at that point, when the Jews go into their worship, is when he goes into action. Now, I've said before, the Apocrypha, that set of books and found in the Douay version and some versions like that, they're not inspired, but they are historical books. And anyway, we find in 1 Maccabees 1 and verse 30, I'll just read it to you. It says, and after 4 years, the king sent the chief collector of his tributes to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a great multitude. And he spoke to them peaceable words in deceit, and they believed him. And he fell upon the city suddenly and struck it with a great slaughter and destroyed much people in Israel. And he took the spoils of the city and burned it with fire and threw down the houses thereof and the walls thereof round about. And they took the women captive and children and cattle they possessed. So that was the job of this Apollonius. He came in and he just plundered the place. What about the elderly Athenian? Well, he had a different job. His job, according to history, was to desecrate the temple. And hence in verse 31, you read, an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. What happened there? Well, we read back again in 1 Maccabees. Verse 41 says, her sanctuary was desolate like a wilderness. Her festival days were turned into mourning. Her Sabbaths into reproach. Her honors were brought to nothing. Her dishonor was increased according to her glory, and her excellency was turned into mourning. And King Antiochus wrote to all his kingdom that all the people should be one, and everyone should leave his own law, and all nations consented according to the word of King Antiochus. And many of Israel consented to his service, and they sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by the hands of messengers to Jerusalem and to all the cities of Judah that they should follow the law of the nations of the earth and should forbid sacrifices and atonements to be made in the temple of God, and should prohibit the Sabbath and festival days from being celebrated. And he commanded the holy places to be profaned and the holy people of Israel. And he commanded altars to be built and temples and idols and swine's flesh to be immolated and unclean beasts, and that they should leave their children uncircumcised and let their souls be defiled with all uncleanness and abominations, to the end that they should forget the law and should change all the justification of God, and that whosoever would not do according to the word of Antiochus should be put to death. According to all these words he wrote to his whole kingdom, and he appointed rulers over the people, that they should force them to do these things. Now, we're just about out of time, but that elderly Athenian fella, he ordered the scriptures to be destroyed, and all they had was the Old Testament at that time, and he was intending to obliterate the faith of the Jews. And so he had pig grease, if you will, smeared on the holy scrolls there in the temple. And by the way, Antiochus knew that was an abomination to the Jews, that pig grease. And then he set those scrolls on fire in front of the people because he wanted to show his contempt for the God of Israel. And then the general Apollonius, he brought in the most godly priests into the temple, and he pinned them down, and he forced pig flesh, swine flesh, down their throats. And those who resisted or fought against him were tied to wheels and tortured to death. Now, there's something you cannot miss throughout history, and that is that God's people have always been an irritant to the devil. They've always been an irritant to the devil. I don't know if you've ever gotten something in your eye. I have, but it's just a little speck, but boy, it's so irritating. Well, to the world, Bible Christianity is irritating. And so you find that at the time of Antiochus, the devil is prodding him along. And the devil knows who we are today. We're called the salt of the earth. Salt preserves, but salt also irritates if you get it in a wound. And so let me just close by saying, if you find some opposition in your Christian life, remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, right? So if the devil is opposing you, there's something I'm going to ask you not to forget. Peter reminds us of it. In fact, he uses this expression twice in his epistle. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. Twice he says, think it not strange. And he reminds us of that because sometimes we see this coming down on us and we go, what is going on? Think it not strange. Think it not strange. My admonition in closing is to just determine that you're going to stay faithful to the truths of God's word in these last days.